Welcome back. I'm Barry Craig. September the 22nd, 2012 will mark the 150th anniversary of one of the most significant events in American history, President Abraham Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation. With me today to discuss the historical significance of that is Dr. Dave Krueger, retired professor of history here at the college. Welcome back.
Thank you.
So, what is the historical significance of this document? Obviously, it changed the course of the Civil War, so put it in the context of the sweep of American history.
In the sweep of American history, from the arrival of Christopher Columbus, who didn't arrive in North America, to the present. Some people have ranked the Emancipation Proclamation up with the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution as being perhaps the three most significant documents in the history of the United States. I don't know if that's true or not. You can rank these documents, but when you get into studying each of these documents, you come away with reservations. One of the things history does is burst bubbles, be it the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, or in this case, the Emancipation Proclamation. But the Emancipation Proclamation was significant in that it did bring an end. It started the process which would end chattel slavery or slavery as personal property in the United States. And the slavery runs like a red thread throughout the history of America, from the colonial period up through the Civil War. After the Civil War, that changes from slavery to race, but that, of course, is beyond what we're discussing today.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Going back to the 1860 election, which Lincoln won, the issue there was the expansion of slavery. In fact, Lincoln repeatedly said, "I will not touch slavery where it is." So Lincoln was a gradualist. He wasn't an abolitionist, was he?
Abraham Lincoln was not an abolitionist. He was, like many Republicans, opposed to the territorial expansion of slavery. To put it another way, he wanted to contain or keep slavery in those states where it already existed, but he did not wish it to expand any further. And the thinking of Republicans was that if slavery was contained to the southern states, it would eventually wither. The assumption was that slavery would need room to expand. Mm-hmm. If it was not allowed to expand, it would die. And so that was his thinking. Abraham Lincoln, however, like one of his political heroes, Henry Clay of Kentucky, was also a believer in colonization. And he held racial attitudes that were pretty typical of whites at that period. Lincoln did not believe that the two races could coexist in the United States, that blacks would always be at a disadvantage for various reasons. Therefore, he argued that it would be necessary to colonize, that is, to send freed slaves abroad to establish their own society elsewhere, be it in Central America or Africa or wherever. And even through the Civil War, and I'm convinced even up until his death, he still believed that colonization was the best way of dealing with the race problem in the United States. Now, he never sought the permission of any Central American nations for colonization, but that is where he planned to establish an African American colony. Mm-hmm. Needless to say, he didn't get anywhere with it. He didn't get anywhere with it because free blacks were opposed to it. He didn't get anywhere with it. He tried very hard to get the border states. The border states were the states that lay between the North and the South, and they generally tended to remain with the North. Border states were Missouri, Kentucky, Maryland, to get those states to consider colonization and also what we call compensated emancipation. There's another $38 term. Compensated emancipation meant that the federal government would pay slave owners, they would reimburse slave owners for freeing their slaves. These slaves would then be sent to a colony outside the United States.
Mm-hmm. Getting back to that 1860 election, if we can, for a moment, not only opponents of slavery supporters of slavery also believed that slavery had to expand because they were so desperate that these new federal territories would have slavery. And that becomes this driving issue throughout the 1850s is expansion. So I find it interesting that the expansion of slavery, Lincoln believes it has to expand or die, but so did these Southern supporters of it. It's the same issue.
Indeed, that is correct. Southerners by the 1840s had become a minority within the United States. And the handwriting was on the wall. Additional states in what was known as the West at that time, that would be what we call the Midwest, Michigan, Wisconsin, Minnesota, Iowa. Those states were on the verge of coming into the Union. There was no additional Southern territory. I think Arkansas in 1836, Texas in 1845, and that was it. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And they wanted to expand. The issue in many ways, though, was irrational. Southerners believed that African Americans were suitable to the production of cotton in hot climates. The problem is that once you move west into the arid regions of Arizona and what became New Mexico, or if you move north into what were Kansas and Nebraska, hot topics at the time, you couldn't grow slavery. You couldn't grow cotton there. Slavery probably would not have flourished, but it's a very irrational issue. Mm-hmm. And the South thinks it needs to expand, but by seceding from the Union, by leaving the Union, it gives up any right to additional territory. Really, I think when you think through what is being discussed, the expansion of slavery becomes what is a code term. We like to use the word code term. A code term for a discussion of slavery itself, because there were other aspects of slavery that were also under discussion. It's not generally recognized, but by the 1820s and 1830s, the only region in the Western world in which slavery flourished as an economic institution was the American South. Mm-hmm. It had been abolished in the British Empire, it had been abolished in French territories, and so on. And in a sense, there was worldwide criticism against slavery in the South. Mm-hmm. So the South was subjected to a good deal of withering criticism from outside the country, as well as from a minority of abolitionists in the North.
Mm-hmm. So Lincoln is elected, and immediately the secession, a month later, South Carolina secedes in December, and the states go out. What was the rush, do you think? If you look at short of war, this constitutional amendment could not have been passed in 1860. The Southern states would have blocked an amendment abolishing slavery.
That's correct.
The Supreme Court was still the Supreme Court of Dred Scott. So the Supreme Court's not going to outlaw slavery. So what was the rush?
The rush, I think, was the election of what was called a black Republican president. And black, by black, I do not mean race. In this what black meant evil, bad, this northerner. And it signified, and he was elected with a minority of the popular vote. He got not a single Southern, he carried no Southern states. He carried no border states.
He wasn't even on the ballot in 10 of the future Confederate states.
That's correct.
And in Kentucky, Lincoln received either 1,366 or 1,364 votes, depending on the total. And that is an infinitesimally small percentage in his home state.
Yeah. Actually, by 1860, the country had become polarized. There were no national political parties. National institutions, including churches, had been snapping, beginning in the 1840s.
And the Democrats finally came apart.
Right, the Democrats collapsed in 1860, and there was no national party. There were two presidential races, one in the North and one in the South. Right. The first state to secede from the Union is South Carolina, and that is really not a surprise because in spirit, South Carolina had been out of the Union since the 1820s. This was a state whose economy had faltered in the 1820s, a state that had increasingly lost its leadership and importance to the new slave states further to the west, Georgia, Mississippi, and Alabama. And there was much emotionalism surrounding this whole issue of slavery. Censorship in the South had done its work by preventing alternate points of view from arising. Much
You
like
could be arrested for distributing
Right.
abolitionist literature.
It's
right?
not unlike the existence of these cable television networks, which are either on one side or the other, and people tune into one but listen to nothing from the other side. And so you'd reach this breaking point by 1860. And then the election of Lincoln. The House of Representatives was in Republican hands. And the control of the federal government was something the South had always counted on for many decades, and that was gone. And so a tipping point had been reached, and South Carolina seceded. And that was, of course, followed by the other states in the Deep South. The states in the Upper South, Virginia, Tennessee, for example, were a little more reluctant, but they eventually came around. And the major issue involved in the secession of the southern states, despite what is said by various political groups today, was slavery.
Absolutely.
That was what brought on the war. You remove slavery from the whole equation, then you eliminate the discussion of slavery in the territories.
Right.
So that
And I
was
would
the central
recommend
issue.
a book. It's a little book called Apostles of Disunion by Charles B. Dew. And Professor Dew studied commissioners who came from the seceded states into the states still in the Union to try to talk them into joining. And it is all about slavery, slavery, slavery. There's also Alexander H. Stevens' famous cornerstone speech in which he says that the Declaration of Independence is flat wrong because it says all men are created equal. He said that is not true, and he is thankful that the South, the Confederacy, is founded on the exact opposite idea. It's there, it's their own words. And when they cried states' rights, they meant the right of states to have slavery. And that's, of course, the same code word they used for segregation and race discrimination years later.
That's correct. And of course, slavery in many ways is condoned within the United States Constitution as originally written. And slavery was a sticking point. It gave the South an advantage in representation in Congress and in the Electoral College by the way in which slaves could be counted.
3/5.
As 3/5, a slave could be counted, a demeaning compromise, but nonetheless a compromise at the Constitutional Convention, which counted a slave as 3/5 of a person for representation and for taxation. And so you do get this rush, and you do get the South, leaving the Union. However, I think it should also be pointed out that the attitudes on race in the free states were not all that different from those among Southern whites.
Right.
The overwhelming majority of Northerners were not abolitionists. The overwhelming majority of Northerners believed that whites were superior to African Americans. And in fact, one of the criticisms of the Emancipation Proclamation when it was issued came from the Midwestern states, who were alarmed and fearful that these freed slaves might come into their states and into territories to their west and take their land away from them. So you do have this racial bigotry, alive and well in the country.
Mm-hmm. Timing is everything in life. Before he issued the Emancipation, Lincoln said something along the lines, if I could win the war by freeing all of the slaves, I would. If I could win the war by freeing none of the slaves, I would. He said the paramount object of this war is to preserve the Union. What changes his mind?
He didn't change his mind, I don't think. And he wrote those words while the Emancipation desk was laying on a desk drawer. He was waiting for a Union victory before he could issue it. What Lincoln was saying is that his primary objective was the preservation of the Union. The preservation of slavery or its abolition was a means to that end. If abolishing slavery would end the war and preserve the Union, fine. If keeping slavery would preserve the Union and end the war, fine. But in Lincoln's mind, I really think dealing with slavery was a means to an end. It was not one of the objectives in fighting the war. It became an objective in the minds of many people in the free states, but it was not an objective of Lincoln.
Well, you think about the ramifications of it, and you touched on this earlier, the international consequences. There was no way after the emancipation that the British government or the French government would ally itself with a nation whose sole aim was to preserve slavery. And of course, militarily, it settles an issue of what to do about slaves coming into Union Army camps. Here in Paducah, when Grant occupied Paducah and when federal troops occupied Smithland, slaves flocked to these Union positions. There was no clear policy about what to do with them.
Well, yeah, and on that issue, Lincoln was behind the curve, because in Missouri, the commander of Union forces, John C. Fremont, freed the slaves in Missouri.
He did.
The commander of the parts of South Carolina, Florida, and Georgia that were under Union control freed the slaves, but Lincoln rescinded that order. And it is true, and this is something that has been overlooked for many years, it is also true that as the Union armies came into the South, slaves did up and leave the plantations and flock to Union lines, bringing about a weakening of slavery. And Lincoln was right in saying that the war was going to weaken and ultimately destroy slavery. He thought that would happen.
And it also
the slaves had much to the slaves had much to do with the destruction of slavery itself.
Absolutely, and you think about it also, the destruction of slavery destroys the Southern economy, and it also has a military aspect in that many slaves were used for military purposes. Columbus, when the Confederates occupied Columbus in September of 1861, there were lots and lots of slaves used to dig those fortifications. So you deny the South a source of labor. And also, it gives the Union side a huge boost in the number of recruits. And as the war goes on,
that is true,
volunteering tends to tail off.
That is true, and many northern governors who were given quotas into the number of men their state needed to send to the army are all for the freeing of slaves, so those slaves could fill the former slaves could fill their quotas.
Absolutely.
Lincoln, however, was also a little bit fearful about allowing black soldiers to serve in the Union Army for fear that there might be resistance among the white soldiers in the Army. So he had that racial element to contend with. Now, when Lincoln wrote the Emancipation Proclamation stated that slaves would become free in those states that were still in rebellion as of January 1st, 1863. And this is issued, as you said, in September of 1862, giving them a few months to do it. No one expected those states to rejoin the Union to save slavery. The Emancipation Proclamation also lists those counties in southern states which were exempt from emancipation. And those were the counties in northern Virginia that were occupied by the Union Army, in the Delta parishes in Louisiana, which were occupied by the Union Army, and elsewhere as well.
And of course, it did not apply to Kentucky.
It did not apply to the border states which were not in rebellion. So technically, you could argue that the Emancipation Proclamation freed not a single slave. And in a sense, that is true until January 1st of 1863, when those states did not come back into the Union. And in late 1862, Lincoln indicated that those slaves who had been freed during the course of the Civil War would not be returned to their owner. In other words, there would be no fugitive slave cases, as had occurred in the 1850s. But Lincoln, oddly enough, in his State of the Union address of December of 1862, proposed some constitutional amendments. Oddly enough, one of those constitutional amendments he proposed was that if states would voluntarily free their slaves by January 1st, 1900, 38 years in the future, the federal government would pay compensation to the owners. Lincoln is not talking about a big rush to free slaves.
He's still a gradualist.
He's still a gradualist. He also proposed a constitutional amendment to allow Congress to appropriate funds for the colonization of slaves abroad. So it's an interesting development. Now, the Emancipation Proclamation, however, was issued under his power as Commander-in-Chief of the armies. It's issued, in other words, as a military means to win the war and preserve the Union. Mm-hmm. The reason the 13th Amendment declared that neither slavery nor involuntary servitude would be practiced in the United States, and that was adopted in 1865. The reason the 13th Amendment was written and adopted was because once the war was over, there was no legal or constitutional basis for allowing these freedmen or former slaves to remain free. That's why the amendment was written. Mm-hmm. But the amendment, interestingly enough, frees the slaves. It does not grant citizenship.
Right. Or the right to vote.
Or the right to vote to the former freedmen. Mm-hmm. It does not prevent colonization. Mm-hmm. And so, as is oftentimes the case in history, when you hear some of this stuff, the Emancipation Proclamation freed the slaves. Well, when you start to look at the situation is much more muddled and more complex than it appears on the surface.
Mm-hmm. Don't you think also that the Emancipation reflects Lincoln's view that secession was illegal? That, you look at the Union Army flag in the Civil War, all the stars are there. South Carolina's there, Mississippi's there, Alabama's there. So Lincoln considered he had the authority to do that because, as he put it, they were out of proper relation with the Union and not seceded, that he never recognized the Confederacy as a legal entity.
That is correct. They were out of their proper relationship. And that was a new term to be used because something like secession from the Union had not been contemplated. It's not even mentioned in the Constitution.
Well, it's funny that you mention. Go ahead. I mentioned. I tell my students. I said, now I know that the first thing you do when you buy your textbook is read the Constitution, and of course they get these blank looks. And so when I go through this, I said, well, now I'm going to tell you what the Constitution says about secession. Now get your pens and pencils and get ready to write. It's just silence. Then I look up and I said, in the event, there's nothing that says in the event X number of states leaves. So you're absolutely right. There's nothing in the Constitution. It was unthinkable to the founders.
But there is something in the Constitution about treason.
Yes.
And the definition of treason would be fleshed out, oddly enough, in a case involving a real character, Aaron Burr, and involving John Marshall, of the Supreme Court.
And Kentucky's own James Wilkinson.
Okay, yeah. Yes, that character. But in reality, the case is pretty clear that the Southerners who seceded from the Union, those individuals committed treason.
Right.
And they committed treason because they overthrew the government of the United States in those Confederate areas. You can talk all you want about secession and all you want about rebellion, and that's not treason. But if you act, that is treason, and indeed they had acted. Mm-hmm. And Congress in 1862 had passed a piece of legislation. It's called the Second Confiscation Act. And you might ask, what's the First Confiscation Act? Well, that was vetoed by Lincoln. But the Second Confiscation Act literally confiscated the property of those people who were in rebellion against the United States.
And that would be a typical reaction in any rebellion anywhere, to seize the property of the rebels.
Right. Lincoln, however, was hoping to recreate the Union. And he always talked in terms of preservation of the Union, by which he meant the preservation of the pre-Civil War Union, which was probably impossible once the war was underway and had been fought. And his hopes for reconstruction at the end of the war were based on the premise that you could reconstruct the Union. In fact, he would put the old Confederates right back in power. And that proved to be very much unworkable. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And yet Lincoln is considered to be perhaps the greatest president the country had. And one of the reasons that made him the greatest president the country ever had, he's also the most astute politician that the nation has ever had. There's much denigrating of politicians, and they're considered to be charlatans. They speak out of both sides of their mouth. But politics, believe it or not, is an honorable profession. And the most honorable practitioner of politics was Abraham Lincoln.
Right. And you talk about, again, the astute political man that he was. I always, before a presidential election, tell my students, now I'm going to make a bold prediction that whoever the Democratic and Republican nominees are, they will not pick someone of the opposite party to be their running mate. Lincoln did in 1864. He chose a Democrat. And again, it's because the war weariness, the draft riots, but he was very astute. He knew to win, he needed to broaden his base by bringing a pro-war Democrat like Andrew Johnson in. I guess hindsight 2020, he probably could have won anyway, but
yep.
Hindsight's 2020.
That is correct, and they didn't have Gallup polls.
Absolutely not.
Lincoln was indeed concerned about winning. Of course, in 1864, he was not above having furloughing units of Union troops to return home to vote,
right.
Especially if they were from reliably Republican areas.
Right.
This business of how you manipulate and use the vote, either to suppress it, as is underway today, or increase it, has very much a political dimension to it. It's about winning elections.
Now, you mentioned Lincoln as one of America's greatest presidents. Historians generally rate about three of them, don't they? Washington, Roosevelt, Franklin Roosevelt, and Abraham Lincoln.
Yeah, and Lincoln is usually ranked as the top president. In some places, Washington has slipped somewhat. Washington and then Roosevelt, although as one historian has pointed out, rating presidents is like oftentimes comparing apples and oranges. Because the situations they faced are different. The situation of Franklin Roosevelt faced in a 20th century industrialized nation was much different from the situation George Washington faced in a rural nation with a newfangled federal government and not much concept of being loyal to the United States of America. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And Lincoln in many ways. Lincoln becomes president. If you stop and think about it, if you talk about the Western world, there is a process of unification of nations underway.
Right.
The unification of Germany, the unification of Italy, the modernization and unification of consolidation of France, the emergence of parliamentary government in Great Britain. And the United States, it can be seen as a part of the Civil War, can be seen as a part of that movement of creating a stronger union. One of the problems in the United States is that the devotion to the Union was not particularly strong. If people looked at a map of the United States, they would refer to these United States in plural, the emphasis on states. We look at that map and we say, this is a map of the United States of America, a single entity.
And we're out of time. I'm sorry. We should have gone for an hour, but we didn't. Come back in, we'll talk some more about this. How about that?
That's fine.
I'm Barry Craig. Thank you for joining us today. My guest was Dave Krueger. We will see you next time.